All right, all right.
What's up, YouTube land?
Hey guys, my name is Alen,
I'm Leon.
and today we're going to talk to you about flow states. That's right. And actually, I want to start off this conversation with a definition of flow. And flow is a state that you access where you feel your most... Oh, fucking... Alright guys, so please bear with us, it is our first podcast. But I'm definitely going to define flow right now. I couldn't do it off the top of my head. But I'll say this.
You will have a definition.
Yeah, flow is actually, it's a term in positive psychology, also known colloquially as being in the zone. And it's the mental state of operation in which a person performing an activity is fully immersed in the feeling of energized focus, full involvement, and enjoyment in the process of the activity. And, I mean, probably Leon could say this better, but there's definitely a purpose to why we want to talk about flow today, because we think it's really useful for people to know about it. I don't know if it's that mainstream. There definitely are figures in the world who do talk about it. There are people like Jason Silva, I don't know if you know who he is, philosopher, I believe also psychonaut, if I'm not mistaken, but that's a different conversation. Also Stephen Kotler, which he wrote a book called Stealing Fire, actually, which definitely details what is flow, how to access flow, why is it important to know about flow. I mean, I have a few ideas of why it's important, but what would you say? Like, why do you think flow is important to know about?
Well, for me, Alan, I'm technically considered to be a trauma specialist, psychological trauma specialist. So for us, in terms of psychotherapy, what we work on and sort of what we help our patients with is helping them find whatever joy is, or what sort of that concept could look like. Because a lot of times they come from a pretty traumatic background, and they come with a pretty traumatic past. And so when it comes to flow, right, and what that looks like, so as it pertains to flow and what that looks like, a lot of times their brains are sort of hyperactive and they're all over the place. So they struggle, a lot of them struggle with anxiety disorders, and they struggle with something called post-traumatic stress disorder. So so they struggle with PTSD. And so when it comes to PTSD, your brain is essentially now hyper alert, and you're thinking about a million different things, and a lot of times they aren't anything relevant to the particular environment and the context that you're in. So when we talk about flow, and when we talk about, let's say, helping someone access that kind of part of the mind, or let's say that part of the spirit that can kind of allow them to experience joy and allow them to, most importantly, experience some sort of relief, flow comes in hand, because flow allows them to sort of take this particular, let's say, and I kind of am hesitant to use this term, but energy, right? This sort of energy, right? Access it and kind of take it and use it to sort of envelop themselves into a particular activity, where it allows them to shut that anxious part of their brain down in order to feel some sense of joy or some sense of relief while they're taking it and they're sort of performing that particular activity, whatever that may be for them.
Well, right, that makes sense to me, right? If their attention is scattered, there's so many things going on, so many stimuli, and it's as if they can't even focus themselves. Engaging in a flow state activity, or learning about flow state and how to then engage in that, would definitely help them get out of their trauma, get out of their neuroses, so to speak.
Right.
I find that very interesting. I find it interesting also that you were talking about energies. Because I'm supposed to be the woo-woo guy. But
if you guys don't know, Alan is our designated woo-woo guy.
I'm quite woo-woo. I don't know if you guys see in the background we have Power of Now and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. But we do have Flow by Mihaly I can't even pronounce his name. It's a huge last name. You guys gotta figure out what the pronunciation is for that. But, yeah, I mean... for me, like, why definitely, at least from my end, why I definitely want to talk about flow is, it's not that it's just a way for people who are suffering from traumas or other kinds of issues. It's kind of, I think it's useful for even the everyday person. Because, I mean, how much are we taught from childhood about how our mind works? Usually the program is you go to school, it's kind of structured in a way where you learn math, science, English, and yeah, sometimes you will find stuff in English class, some beautiful pieces of literature that really can open up your mind.
Right, and give you an access to the human psyche and human nature.
Absolutely. Right. And that is how people have kind of come to those areas of study themselves. However, it's not as yet like as mainstream as it really should be, because like information like about flow is, I think, paramount to our growth and development actually as the human species.
Right.
And thing is, I think it's important because there are people who ruminate all the time. That they think too much.
And about the wrong things, because it's not as though they're trying to problem solve, because they're often trapped in their sort of psyches and they're trapped in their past. And they think about these various events that happen to them, especially if it pertains to what's called chronic long-term trauma, where they just think over and over again about events that they can't necessarily change anymore.
That's right. And actually, for example, in the book Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, he'll talk about how people, their attention is usually either in the past or in the future. Yeah. In the past, reliving maybe, let's say, past traumas, or just things that it's not necessary for them to remember. It's not like they're in a state where they're brainstorming. Right. It's kind of something that kind of automatically occurs. Right. Then there's the thoughts of the future, anxiety, and to be fair, one of the points that he actually makes in his book, which I find interesting, and not so woo-woo, is that when you are thinking about the past, you're doing it now. Yeah. When you think about the future, you're doing it now. But the past and the future don't have any reality of their own, technically, except as a concept that we've kind of created as a... Yeah.
But I think his point was, I've never actually read his book, but from what I've heard about him, it's not so much that you can't sort of think about the past or think about the future, but I think the point was not to be excessive in it, to dwell on it.
Right, to not have a bad relationship with it. Yeah. Why I found this book to be very interesting, and this does tie in with flow, because one of the main points of the book is how to be present to the moment. Engaging in flow, actually, is a pathway into the present moment. Right. And whenever somebody is fully engaged in an activity via flow, everything else, like concepts of past and future, of traumas and different neuroses, they kind of disappear because they're so engaged in that activity. They're in such an optimal state of focus that it's as if those things that bother them don't exist for that period of time. There's it completely cuts off the momentum of that of those thoughts and traumas, and it's my belief. I think more research should be done on this, but it's definitely my belief that the more someone engages in flow state activities, especially someone who's experienced traumas or has had a bad relationship with their own past, or anxiety or anything like that, the more they do those activities and engage in those activities, they kind of slow down the momentum of those thoughts and those feelings. Right.
And so, kind of from what I know about it, it seems like what the flow state sort of consists of is channeling those kind of emotions, and most importantly, channeling anxiety. So, something that I always deal with, or let's not say always, but frequently deal with when it comes to sort of with the therapy and with my clients, is that essentially they tell me that emotions are kind of their enemies. And it's never the case, right? It definitely could be, but it's never the case that sort of per se emotions are your enemies. Because technically speaking, when it comes to sort of, let's say, anxiety, when it comes to, let's say, sadness, when it comes to, let's say, anger, right? But, anger and sadness are in themselves, let's say, not so relevant to the subject, but when it comes to these sort of perceived quote-unquote negative emotions, it's so interesting because there's really not, or can't, or don't always have to be so negative. So when we talk about sort of that flow state, right, you can actually, and what you are doing is, right, and it's something that you said to me earlier, and I hope that Alen gets a chance to tell you guys, right, about sort of this idea that this activity, right, that it's not too easy, not too hard, right? So what that means is that, right. So do you want to first, before I continue? Yeah, go ahead.
So to enter flow, right, because that's actually very important. It's not just important to highlight what flow is and why it's important to go into flow. There's actually ways and methods to enter a flow state. And actually, there are many. First, I'll say this. Whatever activity you will be engaging in is something that has to be something that matches your current skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So it can't be something that's too difficult, because
Right.
otherwise it's too overwhelming,
Yep.
and you'll be discouraged, and you may not try to engage in that activity.
Right.
Then, if it's something that's too easy, it's not challenging enough. It doesn't really consume much of your attention,
Right.
and it's not so good. But when you have a challenge that is moderately difficult,
Yep.
to borrow a word that Leon helped me with, something that's moderately difficult, it'll match your current skill set, and it'll be something that will kind of have you, let's say, leaning on your edge,
Right.
in a sense.
Yep. And I love that term, leaning on your edge. 'Cause I'm
got
gonna
it
come back
from the
to
woo-woo
it. And I got it, but I'm gonna come back to it. I like that term.
I blame Tony Robbins and all those guys. But anyway,
Yeah.
I digress. So, yeah,
leaning on your
when
edge.
you're leaning on your edge, you're trying your hardest, and it's not something that's so. It's strange. It's like, for example, one example of a flow state activity that could put you in flow, which is actually it's important. Let's say, in the domain, let's say, of exercise.
Yep.
So, I'll preface this with a story. Once upon a time, I was not such a happy guy.
Yeah.
Right. I was what's the word? Neurotic. I was neurotic. That's right. I couldn't even access that. My brain wouldn't allow me because I've forgotten what that was like.
No, it's probably
which is
because
good.
you're in the flow state.
Yes. There you go. So I used to be very neurotic, think a lot, all that.
Yeah.
But the moment I started going to the gym and I was running, of course I did it on a treadmill. I was once upon a time like 300 pounds, all that. Not to stroke my... Okay, main point. Okay, because I was getting... Okay, what I did was, as I was running, I'd also be listening to music, but that may or may not be necessary. But while I was running... And it wasn't too difficult. It was for as long as I could manage. I would start to, like, at least mentally, relax. Mm-hmm. It was very strange. It was as if, like, all the things that were bothering me, whether it was a relationship or something going on with my family, or maybe even things that aren't even real, but I was just perceiving it like that in my mind because people do that. That exists, yeah. I noticed that, I would go into a flow state. Like, I didn't know it was flow at the time, actually. I was like, I thought it was magic. Mm-hmm. It actually, it was very cool. Like, especially while I was listening to music, I would be creating music videos in my head as I'm running. Mm-hmm. It was cool. I listened to, let's say, Metallica or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's like, boom, the bounce. And I was like, yeah, it felt really good. Yeah, and... so that helped me a lot because as I noticed that I was feeling really good while running, I kept engaging in those activities. Yeah. And the more I engaged in that, the better and more clear my thinking overall became. I mean, of course, it's mainly centered on the activity. Like, that's what the convo was about the activity itself. Yeah. But I noticed that I wanted to do that activity more and more because I kept accessing that state.
Right, and one could even argue that in a sense that you were progressing in that activity, right? You're building your muscles, you're building your stamina.
Yeah, that's
right.
True.
So, I mean, if you think about it, right, and we talk about kind of what's called self-actualization, right? Yes, right, this concept of, like, I want to be kind of like the best person that I can be, that's certainly a part of it. Mm-hmm. But just to kind of go back a sec, right?
Of course.
So that part about emotions, right? And so I love it because Alen mentioned this part about, like, what flow is in terms of, let's say, difficulty levels. So when we talk about emotions and when we talk about emotions as your friends rather than kind of your enemies, technically speaking, it actually maps pretty well on our concept, psychologically speaking, of anxiety. So anxiety, right, it exists, let's say, like on the bell curve, right? Like we all kind of seen that statistical bell curve, right? That sort of, right, kind of peaks on top with the summit, right, and then has these two sort of endpoints. And so the thing is with anxiety, right, we have this sort of cultural misconception that it's this terrible thing, that nobody should be anxious, right? Sort of there have been so many different books have written about sort of stop worrying, stop being anxious, stop being afraid, right? But technically speaking, that anxiety is actually a good thing. So if you think about it, right, and you look at it in terms of, let's say, you look at it in terms of kind of like this sort of spectrum of anxiety, right? So let's say if we were to kind of map it out in the, let's say to use an example, let's say I want to become an MD, right? So I want to become a doctor. And if we were to map it out in that way, right, let's say sort of at the one end of the spectrum, there isn't much motivation, right? Let's say the person at that end of the spectrum doesn't really want to become a doctor. So therefore, he's not really anxious. So there isn't any motivation, there's no anxiety, right? So this idea is that, like, I don't really, or his idea is essentially, or her idea, is that I don't want to become a doctor. It's not important to me. So there has to be some fear of failure in order to achieve whatever it is that you want to. So if, let's say, there's no motivation, in essence, there's no anxiety either. But then when we
Very
get...
interesting.
Yes.
I mean, you could oh, sorry, go ahead.
Right.
You could reason this,
Yeah.
but I've never heard it put that way.
Okay.
So yeah, like, just real quick, normally when we're talking here, it's like as if we both assume that we both know
Right, that's true.
each other knows.
Yeah.
But this is very cool, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's okay.
Yeah.
So then at the other end of the spectrum, we have too much anxiety, which is debilitating, right? So at that end of the spectrum, right, technically speaking, there would be motivation, but it's so sort of this idea of, let's say, becoming a doctor, it's so sort of intense, and it's so kind of tied in with the person's identity that the motivation is essentially squashed by the debilitating anxiety. So the person doesn't really actually act toward that goal. But then here in the middle is what we call the sweet spot of anxiety, where it's, where it's not too little, right, that there's obviously no kind of motivation or consideration of whatever the goal is in the beginning, but there isn't too much where the consideration of the goal is essentially kind of squashed by, obviously, the debility.
Which is why we come full circle back to flow.
Yes, yeah, and when we talk about flow, why I think it really maps well to this is when we talk about sort of the peak of this, right? So the peak of anxiety says that it has to be moderate, right? Essentially saying that in a sense that the challenge can't be too easy. Where, like, let's say let's say I didn't care about being a doctor or becoming a doctor, I could say, well, it's because maybe it's too easy, right? Which is, I mean, just bear with me for hypothetical terms. So let's say it's sort of in more in a hypothetical sense. So let's say it's too easy, right? So the person's like, I don't care, right? This wouldn't make me feel good about myself. There's likely another reason for it, but let's say if it were another activity, right, the person may not want to do it because it's too easy. But then at the other end of the spectrum, you have the debilitating anxiety, which may mean that, well, I don't want to become a doctor because it's too hard for me, and it's not something that I'd be interested in. So if maybe this person were to take the sort of first step to becoming a doctor, essentially they'd be paralyzed just knowing, oh my God, there's no possible way that I could do it. But then, right, let's say if somebody really loves medicine and they really believe in themselves, then they're at that optimal state of anxiety where they're in sort of flow, right? And it can be conceptualized that way. Where the flow state is essentially not only this sort of drive and this energy and this sort of, let's say, filtered vision, right, into what you want to become, into your sort of goal, right? But it's also this idea that I want to, or I don't want to fail. It's I'm afraid of failing, right? But so therefore, because I don't want to fail, right, it's going to sort of help me or it's going to help motivate me to become this person or to become or to reach this particular goal that I want to. So it's sort of going hand in hand with the drive of I want to become a doctor and the sort of fear of, oh my God, I don't really want to fail at this because it's really important to me. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied in with my identity where, let's say, the person doesn't have to say, oh, well, if I don't become a doctor, I want to give up on life. I mean, the person may know that there are other options for them, and you know what, they may be reasonably good options for them, but for them, sort of becoming a doctor, let's say, is the pinnacle of what they want to do for a living. And so for them, it's the first option. So it's not all or nothing, whereas like the paralyzed person might think it's doctor or bust, right? And the other person might think, I don't even care what I do for a living, right? None of this really matters to me. But the optimal sort of state says, like, it's not all or nothing, but this is what I really want to do, and sort of that flow state, right? And kind of going back to sort of trauma, it's sort of rechanneling that anxiety. It's taking that anxiety and using it for something constructive, right?
So in that case, then I want to tie it to something we discussed kind of prior to the podcast. We made some notes, and actually,
we write stuff down.
One thing we were looking at an article about self-actualization.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Leon wrote down was purpose, which I kind of wanted to get into actually right now, which is, so based on what you just said, that means that whoever, let's say, is watching this, and they're kind of trying to determine where they're at, let's say they have something they, let me put it this way, purpose, right? Would you say that for the person watching this, if, let's say, they identified whatever is their purpose in life, or let's say they don't have one, would you recommend that, like in the case with someone wanting to be a doctor, would you recommend that they try to find out what that purpose is, or if they already, of course, I mean, that goes without saying. Right. Maybe I'm just posturing for the audience, I don't know. But would you say then, let's say they know what their purpose is,
right?
Is there something, I suppose, this is very difficult actually. Say somebody has a purpose like not necessarily wanting to be a doctor.
Right.
I don't know. Let's say they want to be an engineer or something like that. Mm-hmm. Would you recommend that? Like, what would you say that somebody who has a purpose that they want to do? What do you think that they should do to, if they're, wow, this is a lot of stuttering.
It's okay.
It's okay. We'll edit this out. But say, what would you recommend somebody does in order to get themselves into flow with whatever their field of study is?
Right.
Like, or how would they orient themselves? Because in the case of somebody who is presented with the option of, oh, you can be a doctor,
right,
or something like that, it's not like, or for example, for the person who it's too difficult to become a doctor,
right.
I mean, how would you suggest that whoever's watching this, how would they orient
right.
themselves in order to kind of gauge where they're at with their vision, with their purpose, mm-hmm. in order so that they can attempt to access flow within that purpose? This way, they can kind of align themselves in a way that gets them on their path. Because here's the thing, like, I'm sure somebody can have a purpose,
right.
but then it's too general. For example, when I say purpose, for anyone who's watching this, it can be a million different things for whoever's watching.
Yes, and I think that that's an important point. So
yeah.
Before I answer your question, so what I want to really focus on is this concept of self-actualization and what that means. So a lot of my ideas are essentially not really my ideas, so they come as most ideas really aren't. So they come from the clinical psychologist named Scott Barry Kaufman. So he teaches at Columbia University, and he studies self-actualization, mm-hmm. and he's, I would say, the forerunner, or at least in sort of modern times, the forerunner of that concept. And so the way sort of that he defines it as this, let's say, self-actualization in this sense is essentially the optimal self, being the kind of best person that you can be. And so the connection that I find within his whole sort of construct of self-actualization and between that and flow is essentially this idea of purpose. It's sort of like, well, self-actualization is essentially, it's combined of these various concepts, 10 different things, right? These 10 different things that make you the best person that you can possibly be. And so one of them, a really significant portion of it, is what's called the sense of purpose, right? And so for Scott, this example, or his example, is essentially something along the lines of, I feel a great responsibility and duty to accomplish a particular mission in life. So for him, the flow state, right, if he would even call it that, which he might, right, because he's actually, right, and he knows full well about the concept. He's actually written about it as well.
Of course,
right.
The article was centered on self-actualization. So
right. So essentially for him, that kind of flow comes through that particular sense of having a mission in life. So for him, a mission in life could literally be anything, and it doesn't.
Okay.
Yeah,
I see.
And it doesn't necessarily have to be like, let's say, a particular career. And so like when my clients come in, they frequently tell me, maybe not frequently, but sometimes they tell me like, hey, I'm really unhappy with my life, and I'm unhappy with my career, and I made a bunch of bad choices. Therefore, like, it's impossible for me to feel like I have a purpose. And that's actually not true, because technically speaking, we have various purposes in our lives that we create every single day. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, right, like let's say you picking up the phone and actually calling your mom, which apparently most Americans don't do, right? That's in a sense of purpose because you're making her happy in that particular moment, right? Sort of being there for a grieving friend, or being there for a friend who's upset, that's another purpose. Let's say even studying, right? Going to, let's say, a class, or maybe even a class you don't like, and let's say taking a particular course that, let's say may not in the particular moment enrich you, but is sort of leading to something better, right? Leading to, let's say, a particular degree that you want. That's purpose, mm-hmm. right? Sort of taking care of your child, taking care of even the pet, right? All of that is purpose. So when we kind of conceptualize purpose, there's actually no hierarchy here, which is the beautiful thing about it. And so I just really just use the term doctor in the sense of like, it's just something that people can kind of, let's say, what's the word? It's an image that pops up frequently in people's minds, right? They know doctor, right? And they think, oh, hard thing to do, right? So, which is why if we kind of talk about that chart, right, it's something that'll quickly make sense for people.
That makes sense.
Right. And then, but when we talk about purpose, there's literally no hierarchy to it. So, and that I think is the beauty of flow state, that it literally is accessible to every single person who wants it.
No, that absolutely. And that's really interesting that you could have anything as your purpose,
yes, right?
But again, back to what how to get into flow,
right.
is it something that kind of meets with your current skill set, or kind of is moderately challenging?
Right.
So, for example, I mean, okay, I guess if somebody doesn't call their mom all the time and then they call their mom, there may be a feeling somebody might have prior to that phone call.
Right.
It's probably not something that they can't handle, but it is something that they might feel, I wouldn't say anxiety, but there's definitely some kind of... I've had it.
Well, there could be
myself.
anxiety if you haven't talked to her in a long time.
Okay, so I would definitely say this. So once upon a time, I did not call my parents every day.
Yeah.
Now I do. It's something I got into. It's a habit.
Yeah.
But when I was engaging in trying to perform the habit every day, prior to that call, I felt like it was a little difficult.
Right.
Then when I did finally do it, I realized, oh, this is great. And then I'm talking to them now.
And you enjoy it.
And I
right.
and I do enjoy
right.
it. And I also feel good about it because I'm kind of fulfilling my duty, my purpose.
Yes, right. At least in that sense.
Great.
Yeah,
okay.
right?
What do you think about
You're being
this?
a good son, right? Is that not like one of our
It's
roles?
definitely fulfilling something.
Yeah.
I definitely feel good about it. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But don't you think having some kind of grand purpose,
mm-hmm.
even though I understand what you literally just said, which is
right.
there really shouldn't be any kind of hierarchy.
Right.
But I kind of noticed that when you do have a grand purpose, at least in my own experience,
right.
it's very strange. It's like you kind of develop these quote unquote personal boundaries
Right.
to nonsense. Let's say it differently. I suppose. Okay, so once upon a time, I used to be ruminate a lot, think a lot, all that.
Yeah.
Once I did decide on what my purpose was, which is of course something kind of that this podcast kind of lines up with, which
right.
is telling people about concepts like flow state,
Yep.
and other ones we're definitely going to discuss somewhere down the line. I definitely want to get into ego, but that's a
wow.
that's a different one. But anyway,
Narcissistic personality disorder.
yeah, we could get into
right.
where was I?
Right, flow state.
Yeah, I know. no, that I know.
These are the bloopers.
These are Right. So when I started.
Oh, grand purpose. The grand purpose.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Once I realized what my own grand purpose was,
Right.
I realized I wasn't thinking as much about those other things.
Yeah.
It kind of cleared up my thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I would say even the purpose itself put me in a flow state.
Mm-hmm.
But it was as if it was kind of like for the whole day, every day.
Right.
Now, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't characterize all the attributes of that particular version of the flow state.
Mm-hmm.
And I understand we're probably, this would require a few more distinctions and nuance to kind of build on this. I mean, yeah, the kind of flow state you might engage in through exercise.
Yep.
Or doing any kind of task that kind of engages you.
Yep.
It may be different from what I'm trying to put out here, but it definitely felt like for the whole day I would maintain sort of this these boundaries to my own automatic thought processes. It was as if I wouldn't even let bullshit in.
Right.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, would you say that that's kind of like, going into flow if you have something that you're kind of aiming for every single day?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I understand that normally when you're talking about flow state, it's something that it happens for a while or for as long as you engage in a certain activity.
Yeah.
But it's at least my belief, my woo-woo belief, that that's going to be a constant joke throughout the podcast, by the way. That when you do have this grand purpose, as opposed to it could be any purpose,
right.
it kind of is also something that can put you into flow. And I mean, I would say to anyone watching, if let's say they don't have a purpose, I would say make one. Write one down maybe.
And I would even argue that a lot of you guys out there already probably do have several purposes. I mean, you're all in some way, you're either family members, friends, right? You engage in activities that you enjoy. So technically speaking, right, when we talk about a sort of grand purpose, it doesn't necessarily have to be something that's, kind of quote unquote self-transcendent. So if you think about it, right, if hypothetically speaking, if let's say running, right, running is that thing that which gets you into flow state, right? That thing that really sort of kind of gears you up and gets you going. You can technically become a marathon runner, and that could be a grand purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be one big thing, and then it doesn't have to be something that's connected to
But wouldn't you say that maybe then the purpose would be? I mean, yeah, I get it. The purpose of running is to run.
Right. Well, to
mean
develop in this case, if you're going to become a marathon runner, right? Right. To develop stamina, to develop, let's say, your muscle mass.
But say you're trying to then become a marathon runner, would you say becoming a marathon runner is then that purpose? Right,
the grand purpose, or a grand purpose.
I see.
So when you say grand purpose, I think what you're saying
it's like it's just something I'm kind of borrowing this from the woo-woo people. From,
what you got?
I'm just but from this, like from self-help.
Right.
A lot of different motivational speakers or people in self-help, they really talk a lot. It's a common kind of thread about having a grand, like this big vision that you're trying to strive towards. And when you have this big vision, and different people will wax philosophically on what it does. One person that I'm gonna refrain from saying his name, but one person who, because he's not, maybe one day, it's fine. He says when you have a really great, like a huge purpose in life, you automatically develop these personal boundaries that like keep anything that has nothing to do with that purpose away from you. When I tried it, because when I first heard this idea, it sounded great, and I was like, okay, cool. And then also, when I was studying psychology, philosophy, it's not like I heard anyone talk about how to practically use certain concepts. It was just more like just elaborating on what those concepts are and what they mean. But when you get into the, being practical with it, I did notice that a lot of, I'm saying this, for the fifth time? I noticed a lot of things that used to bother me didn't bother me anymore. But that's, but that's interesting. But what you're saying about having, like, all kinds of purposes. Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a grand purpose.
Right. And so it's interesting because, as I'm sure you know, you've read Viktor Frankl, he argued essentially that the sort of purpose that we have in life is actually a multitude of purposes, that it's actually a response to a particular environment and to the context that we're in. So if, let's say, something sort of, let's say, if you're in a trying sort of circumstance, right? Maybe perhaps, let's say a loved one is sort of sick or is ill, right? Kind of in a more kind of simple example. So a loved one is sick, and so Viktor Frankl would say, like, okay, so what is life demanding of you at this moment, right? What is its purpose, right, in this case? And so, I mean, it wouldn't necessarily be a grand purpose because, I mean, who knows how long the person can be sick for.
That just totally, okay, finally that definitely makes a lot of sense.
Right. So it's like life demands a certain purpose of you, and in that particular case, the purpose could be being a caregiver, right? And it's sort of very similar to what we talked about earlier, right? With, let's say, even calling your mom. Technically speaking, maybe your life doesn't demand it, but maybe your mom does that you call her, right? And in a sense, you're fulfilling a purpose in that sense, right? That's your objective, right? And it's an objective that's particularly, or could be, connected to this idea of flow. It could be connected to this idea of, like, I'm going to really enjoy this thing that I'm doing in a moment, and I'm going to sort of put all of my energy into it. Whether it is or isn't connected to anxiety, I'm not sure that it has to be, right? Because it could be sort of a more relaxed activity. But I think the point of flow is essentially that you're putting everything that you have, you're being mindful of what you're doing.
I mean, I would say even doing this podcast is a way to get into flow.
Yeah.
It's actually very funny. As I'm talking, like, actually feel good that we're
right. Yes,
it's interesting.
Right, and I'm not thinking about anything but this podcast right now, and the sort of ideas.
Now I'm thinking about it. I'm just playing.
With the ideas that we're talking about, right? And I have all of these ideas in my head, as I'm sure you do of yours. But this is like the perfect example of flow. This podcast, it's sort of taking taking kind of the world around you and shutting it off and doing this thing that you believe needs to be done, right? Whether it's a purpose or whether it's just something that you feel like you enjoy.
And what's fascinating, very fascinating actually, is prior to us even doing this podcast, we were kind of like thinking about how we're going to do it.
Right.
And we weren't sure how it's going to go. But I like it. We're just talking. The ideas that maybe I struggled with prior to this conversation are coming out way more clearly and succinctly.
Yeah.
I definitely know. We were even talking yesterday, and I was like, "Uh-oh!" I kept like brain farting and not remembering anything that like we're supposed to be talking about.
Yeah.
But actually, when you engage in the conversation, it's different.
Right.
It's as if you have access to.
Right.
That information that you learn. I guess this is a different like topic probably for another podcast,
Right.
but there is something that's always been fascinating to me, and I was going to say this for a quick second, which is I always wondered why when kind of you're by yourself and you try to think about the things that you've learned in life, why sometimes when you think about them just on your own, depending in what state you're in or what's going on, you may not have access to the things that you learned.
Yeah.
Unless you're doing something or talking about something related to it, and then all of a sudden it's you have access. And I believe, and definitely from this experience, especially if you're doing some kind of speaking engagement or you're speaking to somebody, I think it is pretty reliable that like a conversation, like knowing that once you engage in conversation, once you engage in some kind of task, like a podcast or something like that, perhaps it is like okay to think that you'll know what to say while doing it. That is something, for example, to anyone watching, they'd have to try it on their own just to see what that's like. And don't just take my word for it, our word for it, rather. But definitely in practice, that is very interesting.
Right, and I would argue that it's possible that your anxiety level was at peak level. Right, it wasn't so right, and I think
I don't want to admit that.
Right, but I think before we start, I think before we started it, the both of us literally our anxieties were like through the roof, right? So it was literally probably. Well, I mean, that's
to be fair, you looked a little more calm.
Oh, well,
to be fair,
I didn't think so, but I think it was at the other end where it was debilitating, and then something happened, man. And it's like, have you ever seen that movie with Kevin Costner for Love of the Game?
Yes.
Dude, I love that movie. Do you remember that scene where literally we're there at Yankee Stadium and he's like mode activated, and then he literally shuts everything around him off, and he just and he's complete. That's flow. That is, if I've ever seen it, that is literally the perfect example of flow, just perfection. Literally, because it's like when you're running, right? I mean, technically there are distractions, but they're minor, right? And let's say maybe you're even given a speech, right? It's still minor distractions. I mean, you might have kind of people shuffling in the crowd or maybe a little bit of noise here and there, but like this dude was literally in the middle of one of the loudest baseball stadiums in the entire country, and he just shut it off and did what he needed to do. Wild. This is just wild.
I was thinking about The Matrix.
Oh, yeah.
But I'm not sure.
That was a good scene, too.
But yeah, when he stops the bullets.
Yeah.
But that's a different one.
That's woo-woo flow.
I don't want to...
But man, yeah.
But yeah, so now to anyone watching, you definitely understand what flow is, why flow is important, and why it's good for you to know about, and if someone you know around you doesn't know about stuff like that, or you want to let them know about different facets of the mind, how they work, and kind of try to make something like this mainstream, I think it could be very helpful.
Yeah.
Because I do find that we live in one of the probably the greatest time ever in human history.
So far?
Definitely so far, yeah. We're all connected via smartphone, internet, all that. We can definitely talk about topics like this and release it on the internet, and if and not even just us. Actually, one thing that I want to do is I want to like definitely give credit to anyone who does stuff like this. Whether it's a Joe Rogan,
shout out.
Yeah, shout out to Joe Rogan. Whether it's I mean, you name it. Like there are so many. If we're talking about famous, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Noam Chomsky, whatchamacallit. There are just so many pioneers of just incredible thought and people who are out there now on the internet. And I think that spreading information like this, even though it is already being released by different people, I think it is important that more and more people talk about subjects like this and get it to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
I think that releasing info like this causes a sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, like a ripple effect.
Right. I love that term.
Yeah. It's like, even if the influence is small, whatever, it doesn't matter, it still definitely changes something.
Yeah.
It adds some kind of an influence out there. It puts it out there. It'll slightly change whoever's, let's say, watching slightly.
Right.
They may then talk about topics like these, or look more into it, maybe read a book about it, something like that. And yeah, that's kind of the hope of this podcast. And this is only just the topic of flow. There are so many things that we can talk about. I'm not going to get fully into it, but one thing that I definitely want to talk about somewhere down the line is ego and... I know you don't like the authentic self. No, I'm kidding.
No, I do. I like it. It's not part of this podcast. Just too much.
Sorry.
Too much for this podcast. Yeah. I'm an existentialist, man.
Yeah. But yeah, I can't wait to talk about definitely other things. I definitely know if we really wanted to, we could talk all day about flow.
Yeah.
But for the sake of having a decent sized podcast, or definitely since it's our first one, we're definitely. I think we're good. Would you? Is there anything else maybe you'd like to say about flow?
Not about flow itself, but I think about just our podcast in general, and sort of just hopefully the concept of ideas in general. That I wanted you guys to know that no matter what we do, right, it's not, even though we present you guys with information and, we talk about various facets, let's say, of our lives and the things that we read about, that these are supposed to be open discussions. That sort of, there are very few things in life that are actually settled. So what the hope is, right, is that this podcast turns into a bigger discussion about even, let's say, the concept of flow, right, and sort of various experiences of that. And maybe, because, we talked about this sort of... this motivational energy, right? And then we talked about the anxiety facet of it. But maybe there's something else that we're missing, right? Maybe there are more aspects.
100%.
Right.
And definitely somewhere down the line we're going to have guests who know about these topics, can elaborate on it.
Right.
And also, since it's our first one, I'm sure as we do it more and more, we're going to get way better at podcasting.
Yep.
I'm sure we're going to just be like, and you know what Richard Bandler said in his book, Neuro-Linguistic Programming?
At page 43. Line 10. Right. Yeah. But I think we just wanted you guys to know that regardless of whatever, right, we're always open to discussion, and we hope that you guys do leave comments in the section below.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thanks for watching.
Thanks a lot.